Hello, I'm Kurt, and welcome to another episode of the FishDuck One-On-One video podcast, where each week I sit down to speak with a former student athlete, outside experts, and occasionally some of our own writers to kind of talk a little bit about duck sports. This week I went back to the 1970s to talk with Keith Gunther. He was an offensive lineman at Oregon from 1973 through 1977. Later was a high school football coach, and two of his sons, Kyle and Curtis, played Division I football as well, offensive linemen for Utah and San Diego State. So there's been all these great individual talents, even when overall the team wasn't competitive with the top tier of the league. And certainly your era, there was Brian Hinkle and Fred Quillen and George Martin, Mario Clark, Vince Goldsmith, Reggie Grant, all these guys that ended up in the NFL from the 70s. And, when people look back on Oregon history, usually they think, Dan Fouts and Ahmad Rashad, 69 through 71, and then they skip forward a while to either Reggie Ogburn era, 79-80, or they go straight to like Bill Musgrave.
Absolutely. It was a different time. And coming in 1973, we of course didn't have Ahmad Rashad or Dan Fouts, but we had a whole host of players that were holdovers from that Jerry Fry era. I had a chance to go to UCLA, and that was the first year of the scholarship limit. And so he came down in I think, March, and saw me on some film, back when they had film, and said, okay, he offered me a scholarship on the spot. And I said, well, sure. And then I went down and met Tim Stokes and John Marshall, and Coach Marshall wasn't all that enthusiastic about me. He just, well, Keith, we got a lot of linemen here, and you're not that big. You're only about 230, 240, and I just don't know if this is the right place for you. And I had the choice between San Jose State and Air Force Academy and a couple other schools, and walk-on gray shirt kind of a thing at UCLA. And I said, no, Coach, I'm coming here. I took one look at Autzen and at that lemon and green uniforms and said, this is for me. I look at them more as just signs of the times, or maybe coaching decisions. The athletes were there. Now, granted, we weren't making, $50 a game or $40 a game like they were at USC and UCLA at the time, which was a lot of money back then. And we didn't have the treatment, but I think they definitely had the horses there. I mean, these guys, you'd go in the weight room and you'd look on the walls and you'd see, Graham and Drugas and all these famous ducks up on the wall, and it would inspire you to want to pump iron. And that's when we started that program. The great thing about the Oregon program and what it's come to, and I know you've seen this, Kurt, is that they brought the players back together.
Right.
Yeah, that Rose Bowl 3 years ago, the Rose Bowl in the mid-'90s, we got to see guys we hadn't seen in 10, 15 years. And this last Rose Bowl on there, and Bob Donnelly walks up to me, and he puts his finger on my nose and pulls it down. And he goes, hey, not bad. There were no snubbers back then. You look at that helmet behind you, that might have a snubber across the nose piece.
Oh, yeah.
Well, see, when we played, they didn't have those. It was just the hard helmet right there.
Yep.
It would come down and hit you right on the bridge of the nose. So we all had our noses ripped open, blood all over the place, probably broke mine twice. And so that's the first thing the equipment manager did, is whenever he sees us from the 70s, he grabs our nose and goes, yeah, how's it looking? And so we had these guys like George Martin, played 16 years in the NFL and has the all-time NFL record for fumble returns for touchdowns, and Reggie Lewis. The guy probably ran a 4.8 40, was 6'2", 245, 250, and we couldn't hit these guys. We had to block them, and it was tough in practice. Really taught us a lot, and I think the thing Marshall liked to do was do a lot of live contact drills during practice as well, which was unique for the time, where we go one-on-one. Mm-hmm. Of course, offensive linemen always have a disadvantage going one-on-one because the defensive lineman knows what's going on.
Right.
Surprises there. And so we cut our teeth hitting these guys that are NFLers today. Bobby Green, famous linebacker, and this was just in 73 and 74. I hadn't even gotten to the later 70s.
There were so many great players that came from that era individually that did go on to success, but the one name that stands out to people actually never played in the NFL. He played for years in the CFL, and as a defensive lineman, you had to go up against him a lot. The guy that always stands out from this era, Vince Goldsmith. Tell me about having to practice against Vince Goldsmith.
Well, I was actually kicked out of practice because of Vince Goldsmith. He was a younger player. He was a 77. He came in, was an All-American shot putter, and he was like 5'10", 5'11", but the guy was like 260 pounds of solid muscle. I think he played 10 years in the Canadian League.
Yep.
It's just a frightening looking human being. And of course, started as a freshman, and here I was, I think, a redshirt junior after the 2 knee surgeries. And we're at practice one day, and we're in helmets and shoulder pads and shorts, and we're walking through. And so I'm out there, and I'm playing guard, I think, and Vince comes in, and we're not supposed to hit these guys. Well, what does Vince do? Vince gives me a forearm, shoves me about 2 feet over. So I go, okay.
So it's like that then.
So the next play, I put my helmet right on his arm and gave him a pop. And the coaches just sprinted over and tore me out of there and threw me on the sideline. I didn't know who this guy was.
Right.
We were just going back and forth. I can guarantee you he didn't feel what I did to him at all. By that 3rd year with Reed, things were getting tough. I think we had Jack Henderson at quarterback, and Norv had moved on, and it was just a lot of competition out there that caused those teams not to be as good as they could. But in '76, I think we were 4-5. I think we'd done okay, and of course we beat Oregon State every year, but my freshman year. Mm-hmm. So that was 4 years in a row. So we did a lot of good things with Don Reed, and I had my 2nd knee surgery that spring, or that winter rather. I missed that season, and the coaches were fired unceremoniously in December. All of them, John Marshall, Reed, the whole group, and they brought in this guy Rich Brooks.
From Oregon State, of all places.
Well, I think he had come from UCLA directly, but yeah, from Oregon State before that. And so Rich Brooks shows up, and he's a former drill sergeant. And I go to register for my spring classes in 1977, or I guess, 77, and I had no scholarship. They had cut my scholarship when they had left, and I had 2 knee surgeries and supposed to have a 5th year of eligibility. And even though I couldn't play, at least a couple terms of scholarship. So I was heartbroken, but I kept going to the Autzen and lifting weights, and then one day, about a week or 2 later, Rich Brooks calls me on the phone, which back then was a big deal to call you on the phone at home. There are no answering machines, and I picked up the phone. He says, "Keith, this is Rich Brooks." He said, "Do you still want to play?" I said, "Well, the doctors say with 2 knee surgeries I can't play anymore." He says, "Well, I talked to the doctors. You can play." He says, "Do you want your scholarship back?" I said, "Yeah." "Yes, I do, Coach Brooks." And so he brought me into his office and looked me in the eye. We kind of cried together a little bit as we talked about what it's like to be a Duck. And here he had just gotten there. Mm-hmm. And he said, you're going to have younger guys that are maybe not as good as you. They're going to play in front of you. You're going to have situations you might not be happy with what I do. But if you want to play on this team, I'll give you a shot. And so he never sugarcoated it. And I ended up traveling that year and playing in most of the games and having a great season. And it really recovered my whole career at Oregon. And it was because Rich Brooks had the forethought to say, here's a veteran, here's a guy that's been around, he'll work hard, let's bring him in. I have the ultimate respect for him, and I've told him this story several times over the last 20 years because I'm sure he doesn't remember. But that to me is just what Oregon football's about. It's giving somebody a shot, giving them a chance. And of course, that year we played Georgia and LSU and
TCU.
And that's when I think Oregon football got its glimpse of growing up. With that Rich Brooks' first year, and you were talking about with Reggie Ogburn and 80, 81, 82, that it's true. You got this gap between Jerry Fry and Dan Fouts and that Ogburn era, but people have to remember that's what Rich Brooks did in a very short period of time. He built that program. So here you've got Rich Brooks, Mike Bellotti, Neil Zambucas, Bill Tarrow, Steve Greatwood, parts of this program for 30 years, 25 years. That
right.
To us, when we come back, 30 years later, is just an amazing statistic to think these guys go back to when we played.
And it's really fascinating, too, particularly in the era that you played, 73 through 77, because you ended up playing for 3 different head coaches, 3 different regimes. When you came in, it was Dick Enright, then it was Don Reed, and then for your senior year, Rich Brooks comes in. How difficult was it to adjust to 3 different coaches and 3 different systems as you were going through your career?
Well, I think you approach it like anything else. You approach it with 100% commitment to learning their system and being part of that program and learning what it takes to please that particular coach. The tough part comes in that you have to prove yourself every year. Mm-hmm. If you've got the same coaches and the same staff and they're going to play certain plays. So maybe I guess the thing I can say is through all those 3 coaches in those 5 years it was just always tough. It doesn't matter whether it was Marshall, McCray, or Tarrow. I mean, it was a tough time. A lot of live hitting. Oregon football's never been easy.
The other interesting aspect of the coaching changes was that when you look back on the teams, it looked like things were steadily improving under Don Reed. The team had gone from 2-9 and 2-9 in 73 and 74 to 3-8 and then 4-7 in 1976. It looked like there was a steady improvement taking place. And the 77 season comes in, Rich Brooks, and it's a step backwards. The team only ends up going 2-9. There were wins over TCU and Oregon State. That was it. Was that a little bit weird, seeing that there was progress taking place with the program? You were steadily increasing wins per year, and the coach is shown the door.
Yeah, it was a shock. And like I said, I was also a part of that group, having lost my scholarship, and the whole thing was very disappointing. And that was part of that deal with a lot of guys leaving the program, players, is I think it gave them a very bitter feeling, and they didn't like how things work, but that's life. It teaches you a lot about life. And what Rich Brooks did is he came in and he would get us up at 5:30 in the morning by beating on our doors with a hammer. And if you weren't there on time, you had to do bear crawls and on all fours up and down the field till you threw up, and then you had to run through your vomit. It was tougher than Don Reed, and maybe that was part of that turnaround we're talking about, Kurt, that happened in 77 with Rich Brooks. It took him a few years to get that whole program in place, but he brought in Willie Blasher, probably one of the greatest linebackers at Oregon, out of Contra Costa Junior College. It was considered a coup, a 5-star for his time. But it was fun having somebody as a great character and a great coach as Steve Greatwood to be able to talk to all these years.
Right.
Yeah.
He was a teammate, and now he's, in the belly of the beast at the University of Oregon program.
He was a 220-pound freshman my senior year. We pushed him around like he was on roller skates. He was in awe. And sure enough, here he was starting and playing. So yeah, but he did a lot of conditioning. But it's so nice. So I guess what I was saying is these coaches at Oregon are very down to earth. You can sit down with Mike Bellotti, you can sit down with Steve Greatwood, and they'll talk to you like we're talking right here.
Right.
There's no ego involved in those folks, and that to me is something very important. The whole thing has just been such a wonderful ride for those of us that played 30, 40 years ago to see Rose Bowl, national championship, Rose Bowl victory, and it's just something like it's out of a novel. How can this be? But you're right. I think deep in our hearts we know, because we've been involved in this program all this time. We know why. We know why they're as good as they are, and that's because they do the evaluations and they get the players and they work them to death.
People look at Dan Fouts and then they skip forward and they kind of forget that these years even happened. But while there's a lot of turnover, there wasn't a lot of wins. There was the building of the foundation that the program was built upon. Why should fans remember your era of Oregon Duck football?
What I want people to remember is that, we didn't give people that much fun stuff. But the ones that stuck with the program and the ones that were Duck fans, those are the people that are the true winners out there that I think of. I think of the families that supported us and the fans, and that to me is my takeaway from that period. Is there have been fans of this program that are doing this for 40, 50 years plus. So they didn't go. Those 12,000 people, those people should all be given free seats to Autzen today when it's packed with 65,000 people, in my opinion, because they stuck with us. They watched and believed in the Ducks, and of course we beat the Beavers every year after that. I think that 73, after that, I think we were 28-2 against the Beavers. Mm-hmm. That's what I think I'd like people to remember as well, is that we beat the Beavers every year. And that, to me, that's one of the greatest rivalries in the country. It's the oldest rivalry west of the Mississippi. I think it's 128 years old now, and you've never seen anything stranger than a bunch of middle-aged white guys yelling and screaming at each other before the game up there in Oregon. It's different than it is at USC, UCLA, or Utah, BYU. Well, maybe Utah, BYU, you get a lot of the same thing, but
not as much swearing though.
But that's part of that rivalry, and part of what people don't realize. People are football crazy in Oregon. They love the sport, and they hate Washington, and we all do because of that rivalry there. And I guess that's what I would just want to have people remember about that era, was that those traditions stayed through that era and maybe even became bigger and more important.
Excellent. Well, Keith Gunther, thank you so much for joining us this week on the FishDuck One-on-One.
Thank you, Kurt.